The year was 1867, deep in the swamps of Louisiana, when the kitchen fire of a plantation became something far more dangerous than a place to cook. The Rutledge family, Colonel and sons, believed they ruled Cypress Bend with bourbon in hand and laughter on their lips. But behind the doors of that kitchen, Esther Carter stirred not only pots of lard, but decades of grief, rage, and memory. What began as another Thanksgiving feast would end in screams that still echo through history. This isn't just the story of a cook, it's the story of a reckoning. One woman who decided the same oil meant for a turkey would become the weapon that shattered an empire of cruelty. What really happened that night? And why does her name refuse to die? Before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us bring forgotten stories like this back to life. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? I'd love to know how far Esther's story travels across the world. Thanksgiving Day, November 28th, 1867. Cypress Bend Plantation lay heavy in the Louisiana air, where the bayou steamed like a cauldron and the sugarcane fields whispered with secrets that no one dared write down. Inside the Rutledge family's grand house, laughter spilled out like bourbon onto polished floors. Colonel William Rutledge, gray-bearded and proud, raised his glass high while his three sons bellowed crude jokes, their suits pressed sharp, their arrogance sharper. They thought themselves kings of a rebuilt South, feasting on land still scarred by chains. But only a few steps away, in the plantation's kitchen, another fire burned. Logs cracked like gunfire, iron pots hissed, and in the largest brass kettle, pork lard bubbled steadily. It looked like the promise of a perfect Thanksgiving turkey. But it wasn't meant for the bird. It was meant for the men. The table in the great hall groaned beneath silverware and glistening platters. Sweet potatoes glazed in molasses shone under candlelight. Cornbread stood stacked like bricks of gold, and bottles of brandy lined up like soldiers at the edge of the feast. Everything gleamed with abundance, as if the Rutledges wanted to prove that Reconstruction had changed nothing, that they still ruled, that their hunger still demanded tribute. Yet for all their laughter, the house carried a shadow, one that none of the men at the table noticed. It lingered in the silence of the servants who moved quietly with lowered eyes. It lingered in the way Esther Carter, the cook who had fed this family for 3 decades, stirred the boiling oil without a word, her expression calm, her back straight, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the kitchen wall. For Esther, Thanksgiving was not a day of gratitude. It was a day of ghosts. Every dish she set on the table was seasoned not only with spice, but with memory. The kind of memories the Rutledges believed had no power. They called her auntie, the way white men did to women they would never honor as equals, and they laughed about her voodoo roots, as though cruelty were a joke best shared over wine. They never wondered what lived in her silence. They never asked what she saw when she looked at them. They didn't know that beneath her apron, beneath the steady rhythm of her work, she carried a wound older than the Civil War itself. The loss of a daughter, a childhood stripped bare, and a lifetime of waiting for the moment when silence would finally break. Outside, the swamp seemed to lean in toward the house. Cypress trees stood tall like witnesses, their roots tangled deep in the muck of history. Dogs barked faintly in the distance, restless, as if they too sensed the storm gathering within those kitchen walls. But inside, the Rutledges remained blind. The eldest, Nathaniel, bragged about his new contracts up north, while Thomas mocked the workers they now called freedmen, saying they behaved best when reminded of their chains. Silas, the youngest, simply smiled, that same cold smile Esther remembered from years before, the one he wore the night he told her that her daughter was gone. To them, this day was nothing more than a banquet. To Esther, it was the stage upon which decades of cruelty would finally meet its audience. And so the house carried on, oblivious, while Esther stirred and waited. The kettle of oil bubbled louder, its golden surface rolling like molten judgment. The ruddled sons laughed harder, never realizing that each passing hour brought them closer to a reckoning that no wealth, no arrogance, no rifle hanging by the door could prevent. History would not remember the Rutledges for their feast. It would remember the cook who fed them something they could never swallow, their own cruelty served back to them in fire. Thanksgiving Day at Cypress Bend had begun like all the others. But before the sun fell, it would end in screams that still echo in the stories whispered to this day. Long before the kitchen at Cypress Bend became her battleground, Esther was just Essie, a barefoot girl chasing fireflies in the dirt yard behind the kitchen house. Her mother, Binta, had carried stories from the African coast, songs sung in a language that no overseer could break. Essie would sit close to her mother's side, watching the rhythm of her hands as she stirred gumbo or scrubbed the floor. "When the pot boils," Binta used to whisper, "you don't scream. You wait, you watch, and you feed it what it needs." It was a lesson about food, yes, but also about survival. Silence could be a shield, patience could be a weapon, and Essie learned it well. Her father, Jonas, was a man of quiet strength, tall and broad, with hands scarred from cane knives and years of toil. To Essie, he was a fortress, but when she was 12, that fortress fell. Accused of stealing a tin of molasses, Jonas was dragged before the smokehouse at dawn. They tied him to the iron cross meant for curing pork, leaving him to bleed into the dirt while the masters carried on their breakfast. For 2 days he hung there. On the third, young Silas Rutledge, still just a boy then, threw stones at his body. Esther was forced to serve cornbread to the guests that morning, her father's suffering visible from the dining hall windows. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She watched, and she remembered. From that day on, the kitchen became both her cage and her sanctuary. By 15, Essie had been renamed Esther, as though a new name could erase the old life carved into her bones. She had the gift they called the hands, an instinct for seasoning, a skill for turning scraps into feasts. But for her, cooking wasn't just labor. It was resistance. Each spice, each cut of meat, each simmering pot carried something older, something that belonged to her and her mother before her. She learned which herbs softened pain and which sharpened it. She learned how lard behaved at different heats, how a sharp knife could slice not only food, but fear. The Rutledge family never saw it. They thought they owned her hands. They never realized they had trained a woman who knew their every weakness, their every appetite, their every blind spot. The Civil War came and went, but little changed at Cypress Bend. The Rutledges traded whips for contracts, chains for debts, and called it progress. Esther stayed, though many wondered why. Freedom in name had arrived. But to her, leaving meant forgetting, and she refused to forget. She refused to abandon the kitchen that held her mother's whispers and her father's blood. She would not walk away from the ghosts that lived in the walls. So she cooked. Day after day, year after year, she cooked for the very men who had stolen everything from her. And every time she stirred a pot or salted a dish, she carried the memory of what had been taken and the knowledge that someday, somehow, it would be answered. Esther Carter was more than a cook. She was a woman who had mastered the art of waiting, who had learned to hide fire behind the calm of her eyes. To the Rutledges, she was background, a fixture in the kitchen, as ordinary as the stove itself. But history is full of fixtures that one day become foundations shaken loose. While the colonel and his sons laughed and drank in their dining hall, Esther stood in the heat of the kitchen, steady as stone, carrying not just recipes, but generations of grief sharpened into purpose. The Rutledges thought the war had ended. Esther knew it hadn't. Not yet. Not until the pot boiled over. The Rutledge boys grew into men, but time never softened them. It only sharpened their edges. Nathaniel, the eldest, carried himself like a general without a war. He liked to boast about his rail contracts and business ventures up north, speaking of progress while his boots were still stained with the soil of enslaved hands. He had his father's temper, a violent streak that flared whenever he felt his authority questioned. More than once, Esther had watched him slam a fist onto the dinner table or send a worker limping back to the fields for the smallest offense. Nathaniel was a man who believed power came from fear, and he wore that belief like a badge. Thomas, the middle son, was different, though not kinder. He lacked Nathaniel's brute force, but he had a venom of his own. His tongue was his weapon. Thomas sneered at everything, the way Esther cooked, the way workers spoke, even the way the fields smelled after rain. He mocked black hands for being too African, as if heritage itself were an insult. His cruelty was quieter, but it cut deep. Esther remembered the way he once spat into a stew she'd prepared, just to watch her face. He laughed as though humiliation were sport, as though degrading others made him more of a man. For Thomas, words were chains, sharpened by arrogance and ignorance alike. And then there was Silas, the youngest. Silas was the most dangerous, not because of what he said or what he did, but because of how he enjoyed it. He had a smile that could hollow out a person's soul, a grin that appeared whenever pain was near. It was Silas who once dragged a field girl into the cane, his laughter carrying through the stalks. It was Silas who told Esther, almost casually, that her daughter Clara had been sent north, sold away under the pretense of apprenticeship. The way he said it, with that sly grin, burned deeper than any whip could. Silas thrived on cruelty like a man thrives on air. To Esther, his smile was the face of everything she had lost. Together, the Rutledge sons represented three faces of the same legacy. Nathaniel was the fist, Thomas the tongue, Silas the teeth. They were men who had been raised to believe they were untouchable, heirs to land and power that stretched beyond the plantation's borders. The war had changed nothing for them. They wore new suits, spoke of new business, but inside, they were still the same boys who had grown fat on other people's suffering. Each time they returned home for a feast, they carried with them the ghosts of their cruelty, though they pretended not to hear the whispers in the walls. To them, Cypress Bend was an inheritance. To Esther, it was a graveyard that had not yet been named. And yet, despite their arrogance, the sons underestimated her. They dismissed her silence as obedience, her patience as submission, her age as weakness. But in the stillness of the kitchen, Esther saw them for what they truly were, men who had built their lives on the backs of others, blind to the day those same backs would rise. Nathaniel, Thomas, Silas, they were not just her tormentors. They were her reckoning waiting to happen. And as the oil bubbled in her kettle that Thanksgiving day, she knew each of their names would soon be written not in ledgers, but in screams. Clara was Esther's light in a world built on shadows. Born in the cramped quarters behind the big house, the girl's first cry carried more hope than Esther had thought possible. She named her after a woman who once tried to escape the plantation and nearly made it, a reminder that freedom was not a dream, but a direction. Clara had her mother's sharp eyes and her grandmother's humming voice, always curious, always reaching for more than the small world she'd been given. To Esther, she was not just a daughter. She was the reason to keep breathing through nights when grief threatened to choke the air from her lungs. But in Cypress Bend, joy was never safe for long. When Clara was 7, a letter arrived from New Orleans. William Rutledge claimed he needed to settle a debt, and so the girl was apprenticed to a family up north. No one said the word out loud, but everyone knew what it meant. She was sold. Esther begged, raged, fell to her knees, but no cry, no plea could change the colonel's mind. The house kept eating, kept drinking, kept laughing, while her child was carted off like a parcel. That night, Esther slipped into the swamp and screamed until her throat bled. The frogs fell silent. Even the trees seemed to lean back in grief. But when she returned to the kitchen at dawn, she cooked anyway. The masters tasted nothing different in their stew, but for Esther, every bite was ash. Silas was the one who sealed the wound. He found her in the kitchen days later, his grin wider than usual. He told her Clara was gone to a better life, gone where Esther would never see her again. He said it like a gift, like a kindness, twisting the knife with every word. That smile, that moment, stayed with Esther more fiercely than the loss itself. Each time she saw Silas afterward, she remembered the sound of her daughter's laughter, now replaced with silence. The kitchen, once her sanctuary, became a tomb filled with the absence of her child. Every dish she stirred, every loaf she baked carried the taste of absence. Years passed, but the wound never healed. The war came, the uniforms changed, the laws shifted, but Clara never returned. Some said she might have grown up free, living in the North, perhaps even starting a family of her own. Others whispered darker possibilities, that she never made it, that her name had been buried long before her mother's hope. Esther never knew. What she did know was that the men who had taken her still sat in that house, still laughed, still feasted, as if her pain were nothing more than the smoke that curled up the chimney and vanished into the night. For Esther, Clara's absence was not just grief, it was fuel. Every Thanksgiving, every gathering where the Ruddled family raised their glasses in comfort, Esther remembered the empty chair where her daughter should have sat. She remembered the small hands that should have stirred the pot beside her, and with each memory, her silence hardened into resolve. The men who thought they owned everything had stolen her child. But one day, she would serve them something they could never steal. The weight of every scream she swallowed poured back into their cups like fire. Clara was gone, but her shadow remained, stirring the pot with her mother. And it was that shadow that turned the kitchen into a place of reckoning. On the night before Thanksgiving, Cypress Bend's kitchen didn't sleep. Logs cracked in the hearth like musket fire. Shadows swayed against the soot-dark walls, and the great brass kettle of lard hissed louder with each log Esther fed beneath it. To anyone else, it looked like preparation for a feast. A woman at work, sleeves rolled up, apron dusted with flour. But to Esther, it was something else entirely. Every pot, every blade, every ladle hanging from the rafters was no longer a tool for cooking. They were weapons waiting for her hands. The kitchen, her cage for decades, had transformed into an armory. She moved through the room with a rhythm born of years, chopping onions, salting meat, stirring broths. Yet her thoughts were far from the food. Her ears tracked the creak of the doors, the stomp of boots on the porch, the drunken laughter echoing from the big house. Each sound reminded her that the Rutledge sons had returned. Older now, richer now, but carrying the same cruelty that had haunted her since girlhood. Their presence filled the air like the heavy smoke rising from the hearth, suffocating, inescapable. Esther's face stayed calm, but inside her chest, a storm raged, its thunder silent, its lightning hidden in her steady hands. On the pantry shelf sat jars of her mother's spices, cinnamon, cayenne, asafoetida. They had survived war, hunger, and years of disdainful remarks from the very men who would eat her meals. To Esther, those jars were reminders of survival, of women who endured by feeding others, even when their own hearts starved. She touched them briefly, fingers lingering, and whispered her mother's words like a prayer. When the pot boils, don't flinch. Feed it what it needs. Tonight, the pot would not need turkey or yams. Tonight, it would need something darker, something heavier than food. The workers in the quarters moved like shadows outside, weary from a day's labor. They didn't know what Esther was planning, though some might have sensed a shift in the air. Perhaps they noticed how her eyes no longer looked down, how her back stood straighter than usual. Perhaps they felt the tension in the way she stirred the lard, slow and steady, as though each turn of the paddle wound a spring tighter. She had carried silence for so long that her intent hummed now like a vibration through the very walls. Even the dogs outside barked uneasily, pacing as though they smelled not food, but fate. By dawn, the table in the big house was nearly ready, set to gleam like an altar to false gratitude. Silver cutlery, crystal glasses, a centerpiece that could shame a church. But in the kitchen, the true altar blazed. Flames roared beneath the brass kettle, and the oil bubbled like molten gold, rolling, hungry, alive. Esther stood before it, her face lit orange, her hands steady. She was not just a cook anymore. She was a soldier. The kitchen was her battlefield, and when the first footstep crossed the threshold, she would be ready to fight with fire. Silas was the first to wander into the kitchen. He came the way he always did, without knocking, without asking, swaggering in with that smirk stretched across his face. The smell of lard thick in the air seemed to please him, like the scent of control itself. He drawled, leaning against the doorway. Smells like tradition. Tell me, Auntie, hiding that turkey under your apron? His words dripped with mockery, but Esther didn't respond. She kept her back to him, stirring slow, steady, her shadow cast long by the orange firelight. For years she had played the role he expected, silent, obedient, unthreatening. Tonight that mask began to crack. Silas stepped closer, boots thudding against the pine floor. 4 strides, then a pause. He reached for the kettle lid, as if the contents belonged to him. That was when Esther moved. With the speed of smoke and steel, she swung the wooden paddle across his face. The crack echoed like a musket shot, bone giving way beneath its force. Silas stumbled back, gasping, his grin shattering into shock. "You!" he started, but the words never finished. Esther's hands were already gripping the kettle's iron handles, arms steady with decades of discipline. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. With one fierce motion, she tipped the boiling lard forward. The oil poured like molten judgment, catching Silas from chest to legs. His scream tore through the kitchen, high and raw, rattling the pots, shaking the rafters. His body convulsed as the lard ate through cloth and skin, blistering, blackening, leaving him writhing on the floorboards. The sound was not human. It was the sound of cruelty meeting its mirror. Esther stood over him, the kettle now empty, her breath ragged, her face set like stone. For decades, she had dreamed of silence breaking. This was the sound it made. Upstairs, chairs scraped. Nathaniel and Thomas shouted, their boots pounding the floorboards as they rushed down. But Esther did not run. She stepped over Silas's twitching body, her eyes on the pantry, where a second pot of lard waited, prepared, hidden, just in case. She lifted it calmly, setting it by the fire as Silas's last cries faded into steam. The house, once filled with laughter, now pulsed with the echo of his agony. Esther's voice, quiet but firm, filled the space he left behind. "One down." For the first time in her life, the kitchen was silent in the way she chose. No orders barked, no mocking laughter, no stolen daughter's name twisted into cruelty. Only the hiss of oil and the crackle of fire remained. Silas, the boy who once mocked her grief, now lay broken by her hands. And though 2 more footsteps thundered toward her, Esther felt no fear. The first strike had been made. The storm had broken. The reckoning had begun. The thud of boots came hard and fast down the stairs. Nathaniel burst into the kitchen first, rifle clenched white-knuckled in his hands, rage already spilling from his mouth. Behind him, Thomas gripped a fireplace poker, pale and trembling, but desperate to follow his brother's lead. The sight of Silas writhing on the floor stunned them both for only a heartbeat. Then Nathaniel roared, "You crazy bitch!" His voice cracked, more fear than fury, but the sound of it still filled the kitchen like thunder. Esther didn't move. She stood between them and the fire, her apron streaked with oil and blood, her eyes steady, her hands bare. Nathaniel raised the rifle to aim, but his grip shook. Esther's calm unnerved him. She tilted her head, her voice low and sharp. "Put that down, or I'll feed you what your brother's tasting now." For a moment, time froze. Even the oil seemed to hush, waiting. Thomas faltered, stepping back, but Nathaniel snarled and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out wild, tearing into a shelf of dried beans. Sparks flew, wood splintered, and the kitchen filled with the smell of powder and dust. Esther was already moving, slipping behind the cast-iron stove. She didn't cower, she positioned herself. The kitchen wasn't their territory anymore. It was hers. Thomas turned to flee, panic clawing at his face, but Esther was quicker. She lunged from the shadows, tackling him at the pantry threshold. The poker clattered to the ground as he hit the floor with a grunt. In one swift strike, she drove her carving knife between his fingers, pinning his hand to the boards. His scream rattled the walls. "You remember Clara?" Esther hissed inches from his face. "She was 7, and you let them take her." Thomas's eyes bulged with terror, his cries choking on guilt and fear. She twisted the blade, and his howl filled the kitchen like a confession long overdue. Nathaniel swung the rifle like a club, charging forward. Esther rolled aside just as the butt came down, splintering the pantry floor where she had been. She grabbed the second pot of lard, still cool enough to lift, and smashed it across Nathaniel's temple. He staggered, blood pouring down his face, the rifle clattering uselessly to the ground. They grappled, fists and fury colliding. He was larger, stronger, but Esther was relentless. She drove her thumb into his eye, bit his arm when he tried to choke her, slammed her knee into his groin. He dropped to his knees, gasping, and she seized the iron skimmer, slamming it into his mouth again and again until teeth scattered across the blood-slick floor like kernels of dry corn. The kitchen, once a place of order and routine, was now a storm of fire, blood, and screams. Thomas lay broken on the ground, his hand ruined, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Nathaniel groaned beside him, face shattered, teeth gone, blood soaking into the cracks of the boards. Esther stood over them panting, sweat dripping, her hair clinging to her face. But her eyes burned steady, lit by the flames of the hearth. She had been their cook, their servant, their silence. Now she was their judge. And with each breath she drew, the house that had ruled for generations trembled under the weight of her vengeance. By the time word reached Colonel William Rutledge, Cypress Bend was already heavy with dread. The colonel had been away in Baton Rouge, chasing contracts and clinging to influence in a world that no longer bent so easily to his command. But when he received the telegram, the one that spoke of screams, blood, and silence, he saddled his horse without hesitation. He rode through the dusk, coat black, gloves white, the image of order wrapped around a man who had built his life on control. But even before he saw the house, he sensed it. The land itself seemed to recoil. The fields were quiet, the workers absent, the very air hanging thick with smoke and something else, memory. He dismounted at the gate, boots crunching against gravel that had once welcomed guests with carriages and wine. Now no one came to greet him. No overseer, no servant, not even a dog barked. The plantation that had once hummed with false civility stood still, its windows dark, its porches empty. When he pushed open the great door, the hinges groaned like a warning. Inside, silence pressed against him like a hand on his throat. He called for his sons, his voice sharp, commanding. No one answered. Only the smell greeted him, a heavy, sickly mixture of scorched oil, blood, and something sour that clung to the walls. He followed it to the kitchen. There, the truth lay waiting. Silas, blistered and twisted, curled in a grotesque heap beside the overturned kettle. Nathaniel slumped near the stove, his jaw shattered, his face unrecognizable beneath bruises and blood. Thomas sprawled by the pantry door, his leg bent wrong, his chest still, his eyes open but empty. The colonel's cigar fell from his lips. He had seen death before, on battlefields and fields of cane, but never like this. Never in his own house, never by the hands of a woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a cook. He sank into a chair, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the blackened kettle. It sat silent now, cold, but it carried the weight of everything he refused to name. "She was just a cook," he muttered, his voice breaking against the kitchen walls. But the words did not sound right. They echoed back at him, heavier, sharper, as if the house itself rejected the lie. He tried again, louder. "Just a goddamn cook!" Still, the silence swallowed him whole. He saw her apron folded neatly on the table, as if left behind not in panic but in judgment. Esther had not burned the house. She had left it to stand, soaked in silence. That was her final act. Through the night, the colonel paced the kitchen, bottle in hand, cursing, shouting her name into the rafters. But the house did not answer. The walls seemed to breathe with the memory of oil and screams. By dawn, he was on his knees before the cold hearth, staring at the kettle as though it might speak. When they found him the next day, he was dead. Eyes wide, hands raw, body slumped in front of the empty cauldron. The newspapers would call it grief, a tragedy of madness. But those who had lived in the quarters told another story, that the colonel had heard Esther's footsteps in the kitchen, felt her eyes in the fire, and understood at last that silence had come for him too. Word of what happened at Cypress Bend did not travel in newspapers or speeches. It whispered through kitchens, fields, and back roads. The official record called Esther a madwoman, claimed she had gone violent without reason, and vanished into the swamp like a fugitive. But among those who had lived under the shadow of the Ruddled family, the story sounded different. They said Esther Carter had not lost her mind. She had found it. She had taken decades of silence, swallowed grief, and boiled it into something the Rutledges could finally taste. To the overseers, it was horror. To the workers, it was justice. And justice, even when whispered, has a way of spreading like fire. In the quarters, her name became a murmur passed from old women to children, from boys in the fields to men on wagons bound north. They told it softly at first, how a cook turned her kitchen into a battlefield, how she used their own tools, the very cauldron of oil meant for feasts, against them. It was not just what she did, but how she did it. She hadn't poisoned them in secret or fled into the night. She had faced them, one by one, in the heart of their power, and left the house standing as a monument to silence broken. That image, Esther at the stove, fire behind her, lard bubbling like judgment, burned itself into memory. The Rutledge estate never recovered. The fields grew thinner each season, workers left when they could, and even those who stayed refused to step foot in the big house. Overseers quit, claiming the air in the kitchen made them sick. Guests from Baton Rouge turned their carriages around before crossing the gate. "Cursed," they whispered, though none dared say Esther's name aloud. To speak it was to acknowledge what she had done, that the powerless had power, that the cook had struck down the masters. For the Rutledges, silence was safer. For the rest, silence was impossible. Her story bled beyond Cypress Bend. In towns across Louisiana, women stirred pots with heavier hands, whispering her name as if seasoning carried memory. Men, once quick with fists, sometimes paused when anger rose, a shadow of Esther crossing their minds. Children in the quarters asked if she had truly vanished into the swamp, if she still walked beneath the Spanish moss at night, watching. Each telling added something new, that she carried a wooden spoon like a scepter, that her shadow glowed like fire, that the oil never stopped hissing where she poured it. Myth and memory tangled until she was no longer just a woman, but a warning carved into the marrow of the South. Esther Carter was not written into ledgers or carved into monuments. The nation chose to forget her, the way it forgot countless women who bled, fought, and endured. But forgetting is not the same as erasing. Her legacy lived in kitchens where women hummed old songs while stirring stew, in the way fire hissed too loud when injustice stepped near, in the way silence sometimes felt heavier than words. She was more than a cook. She was a reckoning, and reckonings, once served, cannot be buried. Decades passed, but Cypress Bend never healed. The big house sagged into rot, its walls blackened by smoke and silence, its floors sinking beneath the weight of memory. Each Thanksgiving, when the air grew damp and the moon hung low, locals claimed they could still hear the hiss of oil from the kitchen hearth and a woman's whisper threading through the rafters. "Just a cook, huh?" Some swore the smell of scorched lard and cayenne clung to the air no matter how the seasons changed. Others refused to go near at all, convinced the land itself remembered what had been done. Esther had walked away, but the story of her reckoning stayed, rooted deeper than Cain. In the quarters, her tale grew into something more than history. Grandmothers told it as warning, mothers told it as strength. A wooden spoon passed down through generations carried her name like a blessing, its handle worn smooth by time and use. In kitchens across Louisiana, women whispered her story over simmering pots, the cook who boiled her masters, the mother who turned grief into fire. To children, she was a hero. To men who raised their hands too quickly, she was a shadow that made them pause. Esther had become part of the rhythm of survival, a reminder that silence, when broken, could shatter empires. Beyond Cypress Bend, her myth walked through the swamps. Hunters claimed they saw her in the mist, barefoot and steady, carrying a ladle like a staff, vanishing into moss before they could call out. Some said she joined maroon communities hidden deep in the wetlands, living out her days as a kind of queen. Others swore she crossed south into Creole country, changing her name, cooking for families who never knew the fire in her past. And there were those who believed she never left at all, that she became something not quite human, a force that appeared whenever injustice simmered too long, waiting to boil over. The nation never wrote her name into its books. No monuments were built for her, no statues raised, no holidays marked. But Esther Carter didn't need marble or paper. Her memory clung to the living, etched in the bones of families who carried her story, whispered in kitchens where the fire burned too hot, remembered in the way some silences felt alive. Her legacy wasn't written by victors or carved in stone. It was spoken in low voices, kept alive in the places history tried to bury. And in that way, she became untouchable. Esther Carter was not erased because she could not be. She became what the Rutledges never expected, a truth carried forward in rhythm and flame, a warning stitched into memory. They called her just a cook, but history calls her something else, a reckoning, a name they cannot bury. And if you lean close enough to the hiss of oil in a kitchen on a quiet November night, you might hear her still, steady, unflinching, reminding the world that silence can be broken and that fire, once fed, never forgets.